Oh, I guess I'm going. Sorry. Yes, the record button. It was hiding from me. Hello there, History of Film class. It's Dr. Bruce. It's actually Tuesday evening, March 31st, and I'm going to talk for a bit about some films from the 1980s and post that this evening, and then I'll do a part two, kind of a concluding sequence that I'll be posting on Thursday evening, so for Friday's scheduled class discussion or class topic. And I'm also going to spend a couple minutes here talking about the Brian Godawa book. I posted an honors lecture I gave a few years back regarding the whole approach to worldview. So hopefully you've had a chance to watch that. I guess I should start by saying this is definitely a very different experience for me, and been kind of doing a crash course on all sorts of remote learning processes, and now I'm recording these Zoom lectures, which is again pretty new for me. The technology is not too bad. It's just a very surreal experience. If I'm honest, I'm sitting here in my living room, my fireplace here, and looking out at my house, and yet I'm actually trying to teach you guys on this particular topic. So bear with me. I'm gonna do the best I can. It's gonna be maybe a little bit of an adjustment, but I think it'll actually work pretty well. So I'm gonna assume that we can kind of roll with the punches here as a class, and still make this as good of an experience as possible. Just in passing, I want you to know that I'm thinking about you. I certainly, again, we're going to make this work, but I would strongly prefer being in a classroom with you. That would be my strong preference, but that's just not to be. So I'm praying for you and for your health and safety. Please be doing the same for me. My family and I thus far have been healthy and we're fine. Um, even my elderly mother seems to be shockingly well, and we're going to try to make sure she stays that way. She's pretty isolated, which is good. And with my heart condition, I'm just trying to be pretty careful myself. So far so good. I think we've got um, the month of April. I think will be a little bit rough on us, just because we're going to be confined to our homes a lot, and that's just the reality. But God is sovereign, guys and gals, and just remember that. Keep that in mind. I love the verse that we have for this year, and from the book of John 16:33, if I recall correctly, and it talks about the sovereignty of the Lord and that He oversees His creation. He oversees everything, and even in our trials and tribulations, He is here. So keep that in mind. Um, Seniors, I'm going to be talking to you guys in some other classes too. But seniors, I just want you to know that it broke my heart to hear that you guys were not going to have a commencement ceremony and that you weren't going to be able to finish your last month at Corbin as you would have intended. And yeah, that particular part of this whole thing really just initially was probably the most upsetting. And I just want you to know I'm thinking of you guys in particular, all my students, of course, but as seniors are winding down and getting ready to be done, I'm definitely keeping you in mind. So I'll continue to pray for you, and I hope you're doing well. Okay, quickly, before I get to the 1980s, uh, and I mean that figuratively, of course, I do not have my DeLorean that can take me back in time, although maybe I'll get a converter for the Bullitt Mustang, and I can use that similarly. That'd be kind of fun. Uh, Regarding the Brian Godawa book, again, my expectation is that you've all read it. I would also like you to make sure that you do watch my honors lecture, because I spend the last half hour, 20, 25 minutes, I guess, the last bit of that walking through some basic components of worldview, although there was some editing that didn't include some of my references to Brian Godawa, but such is life. I'd like you to make sure you've done that. And moving forward, I want you, for the films of the 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s, I want you to do your very best to integrate Gadawa's worldview approach to film and comment as much as you can about the ideas that are expressed in the movies that you're reviewing. That is actually a foundational component of this course. And now that you've had the background, now that you have some capacity to draw from what Mr. Gadawa has said, I think that should work pretty well. Okay, so got this linked to my PowerPoint presentation. So here we've got some film stars of the 1980s. I'm not going to walk you through every single one of them, but obviously we've got quite a selection. There are some of the old guard still definitely alive and well and working in the 1980s, but there are an awful lot of up and comers that are rising to the forefront. So whereas you might have had, so in the upper left corner, Shirley MacLaine, Meryl Streep, Sally Field in that row there, they're being joined by a number of other up and coming actresses. So Glenn Close, the next row down to the left. Carrie Fisher, of course, the late Carrie Fisher played Princess Leia. Sigourney Weaver to her right. Third row down, Jodie Foster rose to the forefront in the 1970s, but really begins to make her mark more and more in the 1980s and 90s. To her right, Deborah Winger just got an awful lot of key film roles. And to her right, another actress that was kind of a hot topic for a while, and really one of the actresses that a lot of directors were trying to get to sign on to their pictures. Her name is Sean Young. Michelle Pfeiffer, bottom left, beautiful actress in a lot of really good movies in the 1980s and 90s. And again, one of the more sought after actresses of her time. Kelly McGillis there in the center bottom row. And then lastly, Meg Ryan. For the gentleman over on the right, you probably recognize Paul Newman and Robert Redford. And then over in the top right corner, with me, I'm kind of covering half of his face here. That's Mr. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood. Next row, we've got De Niro and Al Pacino to his right, and then, of course, Jack Nicholson. And third row down for the gents, left third row is, of course, Harrison Ford, Robin Williams. And here we've got some of the youngsters kind of coming up to the forefront and seizing hold of Hollywood, the Hollywood film industry. Third row down and far right, that is, of course, Mel Gibson. He does not look like that anymore, but that's what he looked like in the 80s. And then the up-and-comers like Kevin Costner, and then to his right, very young Tom Cruise. And then you probably recognize the guy in the bottom row to the far right, and that is Tom Hanks, who is presently with his wife recovering from coronavirus, and we're hoping that that goes well for them. A lot of really great, this is not an complete list, of course, but these are some of the great actors and actresses that are working throughout the decade of the 1980s. So just some guys and gals I wanted you to be aware of. We're going to start with some Spielberg films, and here's what I want you to be aware of. So I'm going to reference a couple of movies in particular, even though I'm going to do a bit of an overview. There are some movies that I've linked for you in the Converge resources page, and you'll see those when you go and access that. So here's my standing order. As you're listening to me talk, if you would like to pause the Zoom lecture and then go and watch the clips that I've linked on the Converge page, you may do that. I think that actually would make an awful lot of sense as you're trying to integrate this and have as much of a consistently strong experience. So just be aware that that's my expectation. I will try to remember to remind you, in fact, to hit the pause button and go and use those links. Spielberg, of course, we've dealt with previously. He comes to the forefront. He's an up-and-comer. He's a rising directing star, if you will, in the 1970s. Some really fantastic films. The two best films in the 70s are The most well-known anyway, and I think critically acclaimed, are certainly Jaws from 1975, and then, of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977. But the 1980s, we begin to see Spielberg branching out and beginning to move beyond sci-fi and action adventure and trying to, kind of get his feet wet a little bit with things like some pretty intense drama pieces and some historical epics as well. So a couple of films I want you to be aware of. Of course, you're probably most familiar with films like the Indiana Jones trilogy, the initial three films of the Indiana Jones series that come out in the 1980s, beginning with Raiders of the Lost Ark, uh, followed by Temple of Doom in 1984, and then ultimately Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which came out in 1989. I will get back to the Indiana Jones films in just a second. He also Spielberg has a real attachment to sci-fi in the 1980s. And if he was not directing sci-fi or action adventure films, he was certainly around that genre quite a bit and helping other directors and producers and writers with their own work. But he happens to create in 1982, I think, one of the greatest sci-fi films, one of the greatest films of the last 30, 40 years of that century, and that happens to be E.T. the Extraterrestrial. So let me just speak about that one for a minute, and then I'm going to go back and talk about Raiders of the Lost Ark. So E.T. comes out in 1982, and it's written by a number of really gifted screenwriters. And one of them in particular, it was a believer, was a Christian. And one of the interesting things about the film is that if you begin to watch it through this faith lens, you realize that E.T. himself exists as something of a Christ figure. I want you to consider that as you watch the film, or if you've already seen it, maybe go back at some point and watch it through that lens. So, E.T. comes down to earth. He's left here to interact with the human beings, and you see throughout the course of the film that he is very sacrificial in his love for Elliot and Gertie and the others. And of course, he dies, and he's ultimately brought back to life. And even in that sequence, it's interesting that E.T., when he comes back to life, he's in this white shroud, and he has healing powers. All of these things are very interesting aspects of the film. And they give it kind of more maybe philosophical or worldview gravitas, perhaps, and kind of maybe add to the depth of the film. But beyond that, it also happens to be just a delightful story, and the acting, the set pieces, the acting performances are wonderful. And the sequence I linked for you happens to be one of the more famous sequences in the entire film. In fact, it's probably one of the most famous sequences from the entire decade or more of the film industry, and that is the famous sequence where Elliot and E.T. go for a bike ride at night, and E.T. causes the bicycle to elevate off the ground, and you see this famous scene where Elliot's pedaling across the moonlit sky, and it's a fantastic sequence. Just from a visual perspective, it also integrates very well with the story. So that's the link that I provided for you. Two other films I want you to be aware of. The Color Purple is an excellent drama, by the way, but it's also a very, very difficult piece to watch. I would highly recommend it, but it's one of the films that Spielberg kind of took some heat for because it was one of his first forays into some pretty intense historical drama, historically based drama about racism in American culture. And it actually was a very, very well done film, but I think he learned some things about storytelling in that film that allowed him to go on in later works to be a little bit more effective with his narrative. Even in Empire of the Sun, a World War II epic set in China during the Second World War, as I just said. So set in China during that period, starring a very young Christian Bale, by the way. As a 13-year-old, he gets his first starring role in film, playing Jamie Graham in the film. And it's a very effective, more effective, I think, set piece with the ability to have some very intense dramatic sequences, but also integrate those with some very necessary, more lighthearted moments to allow the audience to recover a little bit here and there along the way. It's a very well done film. I would highly recommend it to you. But if it's one set of films that Spielberg really gets known for, that he's really identified with during the 1980s, it really is coming back again and again to the Indiana Jones films. So there's a link that I supplied for you regarding Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it's actually the opening sequence of the film. It's when audiences have just been introduced to Professor Jones as he's down in South America trying to collect a particular golden idol, this artifact. And I want you to watch that sequence. It's a really great example for us of Spielberg's capacity to connect the action adventure environment to a very compelling, character-driven story. And yet it's also important to note that Raiders of the Lost Ark is very much actually, as Roger Ebert once again has pointed out in his review of the film, Raiders of the Lost Ark very much functions like a story that's told through the lens of a young, maybe teenage or preteen Jewish boy, right? And that's, of course, we know Spielberg is not a practicing Jew, but he is ethnically Jewish. And a lot of the film, it's as if we're seeing this story told through the lens of this this Jewish boy who wants vengeance against the Nazis, right? And so Indiana Jones and the other characters that populate the film are often featured in ways that allow them to take out their hostilities, get their vengeance against the Nazis, which is part of the reason why the Nazis are very one-dimensional in the film. They're not meant to be these full-fledged characters. They're more oriented toward one-dimensional characters that are beaten soundly in the film, and you see that come to the forefront quite a bit. So please watch that particular clip. I think it would be a helpful one for you. Okay. Scorsese. Now, there are a number of interesting films in the 1980s. I think, well, the most controversial is certainly The Last Temptation of Christ. I might actually come back and reference that one later at a later time this month, but it's something I at least want you to be aware of. So The Last Temptation of Christ is a rightly called a heretical film. It's a very strange film to this day. I'm not really sure why Scorsese, of all people, made it, because he happens to declare himself as a Catholic. So kind of a strange film, to be sure. But the film I do want you to be aware of that I supplied a link to is De Niro in Raging Bull, a film about Jake LaMotta, boxer, from about 65, 70 years ago, actually now. And LaMotta's story is told through this film. And just the brutality of the ring is certainly brought to the forefront by Scorsese and his cinematographer. But I think the compelling thing I want you to be aware of during this particular film, actually, hold on just a second. I'm going to pause this. Sorry, guys. Just had a brief glitch there I had to deal with, but I think we're okay. So Raging Bull, the sequence that I posted for you is a very revealing one in the film. So Jake LaMotta's character, De Niro, plays LaMotta, and in the sequence of the film, we're kind of given a disturbing insight into who Jake LaMotta is and how he how he thinks of his relationships and how he interacts with those in his life. In this case, his wife, who he discovers has a belief that the boxer that LaMotta is about to face is very handsome and has a, you know, has a pretty face. And and in the course of the fight, in the course of the next fighting sequence, we see that LaMotta goes out of his way not to just beat his opponent in the ring with, you know, good boxing technique and points, but he goes out of his way to brutalize the man and to just, you know, wipe him off the face of the earth as far as a boxing opponent goes, and to destroy the man's face. And there's a famous sequence at the end of that particular scene where the announcers say, "Well, he ain't pretty no more." Um, it, these these sequences in the film are, I mean, they're vintage Scorsese in the sense of the realism that's brought to the forefront through Raging Bull is very famous. Just the way that the boxing industry functioned at that point, and of course the way in which LaMotta himself is featured. It's a very, very thoroughly well done film. The other film I do want to mention, you know, they're King of Comedy, After Hours. These are other films by Scorsese during the decade. But the other one I should mention is actually a sequel to a film about a pool hall um, from a few decades before. And so Paul Newman in the Scorsese film, The Color of Money, is reprising his role as Fast Eddie Felson from a couple of decades earlier, and in a film called The Hustler, I should say, from 1961, if I'm not mistaken. And it's also combining the talents of not only Paul Newman, but Tom Cruise, a very young Tom Cruise in the film. So this is 1986. And it's a film that I at least wanted you to be aware of. Okay, I want to move on here. Woody Allen in the 1980s. So Woody Allen, of course, he's been, by the 1980s, Woody Allen had been either doing stand-up comedy for a number of different television shows, but he'd also directed some films. He at this point was already a veteran film director, and these are some of the films of that decade that I at least wanted you to be aware of, although I'm not going to focus on them, and I did not link any particular film clips of these three films. I do want you to be aware of them, and one of the reasons is that existentialism features very heavily in the Woody Allen films of the 1980s. So if you start thinking, as Brian Godawa has walked you through, how we associate existentialism and about, you know, this notion that human beings essentially construct their own reality, and that they should have the freedom to do that, and that freedom to decide who you are and what you think and how you will live and how you will behave, that these are the essential features of life. That is definitely built into a lot of the characters that populate these films. So Hannah and her sisters and Crimes and Misdemeanors certainly would be featured in those lines. And Brian Godawa actually does mention those films. So I wanted to at least make you aware of them as well. Another director that I want you to know, that I think is pretty crucial to know, in fact, is Oliver Stone, who comes to the forefront through a couple of interesting films, Salvador and then Platoon, in the early to mid 1980s. And Stone, by the way, was a Vietnam, or is a Vietnam veteran. He had fought in the infantry in Vietnam, and so it's not all that surprising, in fact, that he decided to, as a director, he decided to take the infantryman's experience in Vietnam and kind of bring that to the forefront. And instead of war films about Vietnam that dealt primarily with grand strategy and commanding generals and things along those lines, he wanted to make his films much more oriented around the individual experiences of the frontline soldier, and especially the soldiers in Vietnam who were who are over there fighting for their country, even though back home, their lives, especially if they were Black soldiers, their lives for them, their families back home in America were still very, very different and certainly lacking when it came to the civil rights issues. So that's kind of an interesting component of all this. What some historians have regarded as the working class war of Vietnam that's brought to the forefront very effectively through Oliver Stone's filmmaking. So Platoon is the one that he wins that wins the Best Picture in 1986, if I recall correctly, and it features a very young Charlie Sheen in the title role and the starring role. And it's a very, very good film. It's also obviously a film about Vietnam. It's a very difficult film. There's even a characterization, at least some sort of a presentation that harkens back to, or at least represents, something called the My Lai massacre, even though in the film that's not what it's called. It's at least trying to represent that particular moment that becomes kind of a, not just kind of, becomes very much a divisive part of American history once American citizens find out about it. The other film that I want you to be aware of, by the way, the other war film from the decade that Oliver Stone is known for is Born on the 4th of July, which is based on a memoir by Ron Kovic, who is a Marine who was injured in the Vietnam War and paralyzed from the waist down, and became one of the Vietnam War veterans involved in anti-war protesting. And so his epic follows the life of Ron Kovic, who was raised to be an extremely, maybe even a zealously patriotic boy growing up, who goes to Vietnam and comes home and has a very different orientation at that point. The other film that I did link for you is from 1987, and it's one of the more famous films of the 1980s. It's called Wall Street. And the reason I want you to be aware of this film in particular is because I think it's one of the more interesting presentations of 1980s culture and the mentality that seized upon many in the 1980s. This, as the United States is gripped in the ongoing Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union and all of its allies, Wall Street is an interesting representation because it's obviously, as the title would suggest, it's dealing with the temples of American capitalism through these characters. And the key character in the film is played by Michael Douglas, and famously the character's name Gordon Gekko. And the sequence I linked for you guys deals, with this famous speech that Michael Douglas's character gives about the power of greed, and he presents this through a very Darwinian mold. So that's very purposeful for Oliver Stone. The idea that capitalism, that those who embrace capitalism somehow believe that capitalism, like other parts of life, are functionally part of the survival of the fittest mentality, and that is an actually critical part of his construct with that film. So I wanted you to be aware of that as well. Okay, a couple of great films by Peter Weir. Well, he's an Australian director, Weir is, and two films stand out. Although I actually am a, not sure I would say I'm a fan, but I certainly appreciate Gallipoli and some of the things that Peter Weir does in that film. It's still much less mature of a film, much less mature of a filmmaking process than we would see in some of his later work. Two films from the decade I want you to be aware of. Quickly, the first one is Witness, which to this point in his career is the only film which Harrison Ford was recognized for and garnered a Best Actor Oscar nomination, although he did not win that in 1985. But it's an excellent film, and it's a very interesting merging of two worlds. So Peter Weir in this film takes the very violent life of a Philadelphia police detective uh, who ends up coming across a young boy who witnessed a murder in a railway station, and the young boy happens to be Amish. And one thing leads to another. I'm not going to explain every plot line here, but Harrison Ford is shot and injured and ends up uh, having to spend time living in this Amish village with these people. And so you have this really interesting juxtaposition of uh, modern life in a big city like Philadelphia, not only modern life, but very violent modern life with a police detective. The character's name is John Book. And yet this association with the Pennsylvania Dutch, right, and the whole Amish way of life and what they believe about good and evil and right and wrong, and it is a very, very well done drama. I think it, over time, it has gotten more and more attention over the years. I think it kind of passed people by too quickly in 1985 and has really stood the test of time very well. So I want you to be aware of that. The film that really captures people's attention from Weir in the 1980s is undoubtedly Dead Poets Society, starring Robin Williams in the title role. And for me anyway, for like many others, it's not that we hadn't seen Robin Williams in some really good movies to this point. So he's Good Morning Vietnam is certainly a film that captured people's hearts and minds to that point already. And so he'd already displayed his acting chops. Everyone knew Robin Williams as a phenomenally gifted comedian, stand-up comic in particular, just a wild personality. But I think for many of us, seeing him in some of these film roles and take on some deeply dramatic and complex characters was kind of a revelation. And Dead Poet Society certainly did that. It's a very interesting film, and I want, if you have already seen it, you know this. If you have not seen it yet, I would highly recommend you watch it. It's a really interesting take, and I think Peter Weir does something that is intriguing, although I think um, maybe in a sense problematic from a Christian worldview perspective. He specifically goes out of his way to present authority, authority figures, older generations, as highly problematic, and more than that, as outmoded and incapable of understanding the challenges of life experienced by youth, and also inherently selfish, as if the older teachers and the parents in the film are incapable of actually genuinely caring about the lives of their children and the futures of their children. It is a kind of a brutal setup to what he does, even though the story is actually quite charming, and the boys at this college preparatory school take part in this poets society, and they learn from their instructor. They learn from the Robin Williams character, Mr. Keating. They do learn some delightful things. It's a really interesting set piece that Weir puts in play. So the piece that I posted for you, the link that I posted for you, is one of the more famous sequences where the Keating character connects with these boys in a powerful way by telling them that their lives can have significance and that they need to write their story, in essence. And it's actually one of the more compelling moments in the entire film. And it's very well constructed as they're looking through a trophy case to pictures of boys that went to that same school that are long dead. And he connects with the boys in his care by saying, these guys had dreams too. What are your dreams, and what will your impact be? And of course, the famous Latin phrase "carpe diem" comes to the forefront. It's a very well done film, although I think there are some worldview questions we would probably ask. Okay. Chicago and John Hughes. So this is one of my favorites. Hughes, for those of you who are unaware of him, Chicago uh, native and a filmmaker who's now dead, unfortunately, died very young, I believe of heart attack, if I'm not mistaken, and becomes known in the 1980s for a lot of comedic films, but they weren't just comedies. He's a very thoughtful. He was a very thoughtful filmmaker, and what he did was he used comedic situations and populated his films with typically very young characters, whose insights, again, very much differed from the adults in their world, whether it was their parents or their teachers or what have you. And uh, I think better than a lot of directors to that point, he's kind of hearkening back to films like Rebel Without a Cause from 1955 in a sense, because the teens in the John Hughes films from the 1980s, their teen angst is certainly part of the storyline, and he seems to have had the pulse of that generation, and I should say my generation because I was in junior high and high school during the 1980s, and we just loved those John Hughes films, and you know, my friends and I, my girlfriends and I would even go to these films and really enjoyed watching them. They were really well done. And we loved the fact, of course, that they were set in Chicago too. Chicago, right? Got to say that correctly. But I want you to be aware that the John Hughes films of the 80s, films like 16 Candles and famously The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, even later on Uncle Buck from 1989 or 88, I guess. These films had a lot of impact. They had a lot of power to them because even though there were some comedic moments, even though there were some light-hearted characterizations, there was also a real connection to a generation of kids who were kind of lost in the flow of this super capitalistic Cold War culture and kind of struggled to make personal connections with others. They also struggled. These characters are often, you know, like all teenagers are. These characters are struggling to figure out who they are and what they want to be, uh, and it really there is a lot of good drama mixed in with the comedic set pieces. The link I actually gave to you guys was I couldn't resist it. I would highly recommend Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, Uncle Buck. They're all really, really well done. The link I supplied for you is from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And the reason, honestly, is because I think the John Candy and Steve Martin pairing is just phenomenal in that film, and it's actually quintessential John Hughes in this sense. Even though it's not dealing with teens, it is taking an just wildly hilarious set piece about guys that can't make it home for holiday because of uh, snowstorms across the Midwest, and so they're stranded and they've got to go by, as the title suggests, plane, train, automobile to get their way back to Chicago and be with their families. And it's you know, through these comedic set pieces, we actually are increasingly drawn to these characters. And at the very end of the film, there's actually um, a quite heartbreaking moment where the Steve Martin character comes to the realization that that his now friend, who he has all sorts of you know, built up memories and thoughts of, as far as who this guy is, who the John Candy character is. He realizes in a moment that the John Candy character is a very tragic man, and that he has actually not been truthful about his life because it's so painful. And there's a really great, very, you know, thoroughly John Hughes moment where the film comes back around and you have this catharsis that takes place where you know, the audience is watching as the John Candy character comes and meets Steve Martin's family in the film. And actually, it's a really, really well done film. The sequence I posted for you is one of the funniest things that you'll see in the film with these two idiots as they have to share motel rooms. And I'll leave it at that. There's a great sequence where they wake up in the morning, after being forced to sleep in the same motel room and share a bed. That's actually very funny. So I'll let you watch that sequence. Okay, this is probably where I'm going to end up leaving off for the first segment, and I want to leave off with Rob Reiner. So Reiner is, formerly a cast member of All in the Family, and grows up and becomes a film director. And through the process of directing in the 1980s, he actually proves that he has a very good eye for detail, and he and his screenwriters, cinematographers are putting together some very delightful films. And the four that stand out in the 1980s are This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, which is a really interesting coming-of-age drama starring Wil Wheaton and a very young River Phoenix before his death, Princess Bride, and When Harry Met Sally. All really well done films. Now, The Princess Bride is a film that most students have actually seen, and I usually don't have to explain much about that one. So I suspect you've seen Princess Bride. It's one of the most quotable films. But something that I sometimes hear about that movie that I want to just mention in passing is this. I've had students review that film and tell me that it just doesn't seem realistic, and the creatures in the film look almost ludicrously bad, as in they don't look real. You can tell that they're people in suits crawling around, like the ROUSs in particular. Keep in mind, as Reiner constructs this, the film is being told to a young boy who's sick at home, and he's being read this story by his grandfather. And Reiner very specifically wanted to make the film seem like this is the child framing these scenes in his head, and a child's imagination is very much at the center of this movie. And when you start thinking about the ways in which the film functions, and some of the kind of off the wall ludicrous characterization that exists in the film, it actually makes more sense when you look at it through that lens of a young boy who's hearing this story read to him and is visualizing, is creating these images in his mind. And I think it just makes a whole lot more sense that way. The other film, and I did post a sequence from This Is Spinal Tap. This film actually is the pioneer for what becomes known as the mockumentary. And it deals with this aging, idiotic hard metal band, heavy metal band, and doing sort of a reunion tour of sorts. And it's just absolutely hilarious. So the one that I posted is probably one of the more famous sequences in the film, where the Christopher Guest character is explaining to the reporter, played by Rob Reiner, actually, he's explaining to him how and why his amps go up to 11 rather than 10. And the priceless moment is when the Rob Reiner director, or the Rob Reiner reporter character, asks him, well, why didn't they just make the number 10 level louder instead of having a different number? And the look on the rocker's face is just priceless as he says, yeah, but these go up to 11. Just a perfect, dry humor, just perfectly presented. The When Harry Met Sally film is also one of the more famous from the decade, and it really was a great example of Rob Reiner dipping into the romantic comedy genre and doing a very effective job. And it doesn't hurt that it starred Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan at the height of their acting careers, very charismatic personalities. They melded very well together, and it's just a very a very late 80s kind of a film, not as lighthearted as you might think. There's a lot of existential crisis that exists in both of these characters' lives, but it is at different points along the way. It is dramatic, it is touching, it is hilarious, it is thoroughly real as far as the trials and tribulations that friendships and marriages go through. It is a very well done film by Reiner, to say the least. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to, for this particular segment, I think I'm going to cut this off for now. And what I'm going to do is Thursday afternoon or evening, I'm going to record part 2 of the 1980s, and I will be posting that, probably late on Thursday night, so that you guys can access that on Friday. And so we'll finish up the 1980s decade at that point. But this will get you started, and please go through and make sure that you're selecting the links that I provided in Converge. I think they will be very, very helpful as far as complementing what we're trying to work through here. So thanks, guys and gals. Again, I really hope you're doing well, and we're going to make it through this craziness. Boy, what a surreal change we've all been through in the last 2-3 weeks, and it looks like the month of April is going to be more of the same as far as what our lives look like. But I hope you're well. Know that I'm praying for you. Again, I appreciate your prayers as well, and I hope that we have an opportunity to reconnect here, maybe in the fall again. That's our hope, that we'll be able to go back to business as usual and be together in classrooms and interact with each other. That's certainly my hope. So hope you've enjoyed this so far. Again, look for part 2 of my Zoom lecture on the 1980s that I'll be posting late on Thursday night for Friday, April 3rd. Okay? Thanks a lot, guys. See ya.